If you've heard of Bonnie and Clyde, you're familiar with the duo that has come to be associated with criminal activity. The most well-known criminal team in American history was made up of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, whose names are still employed as abbreviations for illegal activity. What about the other criminal alliances, though? What about everyone else who has committed crimes with you? We'll discuss 11 vicious criminal alliances that aren't Bonnie and Clyde in this listicle. We'll explain how they got started, what they accomplished as a team, and why they were so successful. Although Bonnie and Clyde are regarded as legendary figures in American criminal history, they weren't the only criminal team. You need to be aware of 10 more cunning criminal alliances that we have. Number 10. Graham, Gwendolyn, and Wood, Catherine May. This week in true crime history, the victims of Cathy Wood and Gwendolyn Graham, the deadly couple. This is the moniker given to a lesbian couple, Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine May Wood, who were found guilty in 1986 of murdering 5 senior citizens at a Michigan nursing home. Prior to their arrest on suspicion of murder, the two nurses had a lengthy history of working together at the nursing facility. In the hopes that their initials would spell out the word murder, they first chose their victims based on that word. But they gave up on that idea. Unfortunately, they were also quite interested in choking and smothering their captives as a kind of torture. Wood would serve as the watchman throughout these crimes while Graham was the one carrying out the brutal killings. Both Gwendolyn and Catherine did it with the hope of cementing their relationship indefinitely. Number 9. Deborah Brown and Alton Coleman. However, when the couple split up in 1987, things took a different path. In 1988, the police were notified after Wood revealed a secret to an ex-spouse, and an inquiry got underway. Graham received a sentence of 5 counts while Wood was found guilty on 2 charges of murder. To begin our list, we have a fairly interesting case. Serial killers Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown killed 8 people in all, committed many robberies, 3 kidnappings, and engaged in 7 rapes. However, this crime wave was just temporary. In 1984, Coleman, then 28 years old, and Brown, then 21 years old, terrorized the Midwest for 3 months. Once they were apprehended and put on trial, they were both given death sentences. In 2002, Coleman was put to death. The disputed assertions that Brown had a low IQ and the nature of the master-slave relationship were the driving forces behind the 1991 decision to commute Brown's death sentence to life in prison. Alton had a long criminal history before to meeting Deborah Brown, but that isn't what makes this case so unique. The fact that these two were so madly in love with one another that they began murdering people together is what makes it so unique. There is no denying that Deborah Brown and Alan Coleman were a great team. Number 8. Richardson and Stank are Jasmine natural-born killers. Jeremy Stank and Jasmine Richardson. It's unbelievable to think that a punk rock performance was the catalyst for the romance between Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Stank. To the dismay of Richardson's parents, the two started dating. They didn't want their 12-year-old daughter to date a 23-year-old man, and for a good reason. Jasmine Richardson was then kept inside her room and denied access to Stank. The couple's forced separation, however, did not last long, and on April 22, 2006, a murder took place. The pair killed Richardson's parents and her brother, who was 8, on that day in retaliation for Richardson's refusal to visit Stank. Richardson was given a 10-year sentence at the time because she was still a kid, making her Canada's youngest multiple victim killer. In 2016, she was released. Stank, however, received 3 life sentences for the killings. These two are on the list because they were involved in one of the region's most horrifying killings, according to local law. Number 7. Carol Fugate and Charles Starkweather. A natural-born killer in real life born to kill by Charles Starkweather. Our life in the 1950s. A couple named Charles Starkweather and Carol Fugate carried out a string of killings that would become known as one of the most heinous crimes done by minors. In Nebraska, one of the first murders occurred in January 1958. Upon returning home at this time, 14-year-old Fugate discovered her boyfriend, Charles Starkweather, had murdered her mother, stepfather, and infant half-sister while posing as James Dean. Starkweather, then 19, and Fugate, then 19, stayed in the home for a further 6 days, excluding all family members and guests. The girl's grandmother eventually had suspicions and called the police. The police were closing in. Perhaps against her better judgment, the two departed and went to a friend's house hundreds of miles away. Then a protracted murdering spree started. Another 7 individuals were dead by the time it was over and Starkweather was apprehended, including 2 teenagers and a husband and wife. In reality, it was thought that Fugate was her boyfriend's hostage rather than an active participant in these atrocities. She is an accomplice, though, according to several witnesses who claim to have witnessed her participating in some of the murders. Even movie makers were moved by the string of crimes they perpetrated, which also served as the inspiration for Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska. Talk about a literal partnership in crime. 6. Copelands, Ray and Faye. The Copelands are serial killers. Ray and Faye, oldest serial killer couple. Ray and Faye Copeland were responsible for a total of 5 deaths in what has been called one of the most heinous crimes in history. The pair is actually praised for being one of the oldest married pairs to ever get a death sentence in history. The Missouri police received an anonymous report that there were human remains on the couple's farm, which led to the first suspicions that these two were killers. Ray apparently came up with a plan to hire homeless men as workers on his farm. Instead, Ray had them write bogus checks to buy cattle at nearby auctions, using them as pawns in his scheme. The men would then vanish, victims of Ray's .22, before they could be asked about the fraudulent checks. When the authorities looked into this, they discovered they had committed these offenses. However, they did not discover any human remains on the Copeland farm. It was actually a nearby farm where Ray had worked a little bit. The Copeland house did contain some unsettling evidence, though. Both of them were subsequently given death sentences, although they passed away from preventable causes. Number 6. Copelands. Ray and Faye. The Copelands are serial killers. Ray and Faye, oldest serial killer couple. Ray and Faye Copeland were responsible for a total of 5 deaths in what has been called one of the most heinous crimes in history. The pair is actually praised for being one of the oldest married pairs to ever get a death sentence in history. The Missouri police received an anonymous report that there were human remains on the couple's farm, which led to the first suspicions that these two were killers. Ray apparently came up with a plan to hire homeless men as workers on his farm. Instead, Ray had them write bogus checks to buy cattle at nearby auctions, using them as pawns in his scheme. The men would then vanish, victims of Ray's .22, before they could be asked about the fraudulent checks. When the authorities looked into this, they discovered they had committed these offenses. However, they did not discover any human remains on the Copeland farm. It was actually a nearby farm where Ray had worked a little bit. The Copeland house did contain some unsettling evidence, though. Both of them were subsequently given death sentences, although they passed away from preventable causes. Number 5. Michel Fourniret and Monique Olivier. The serial killer documentary The Ogre of the Ardennes by Michel Fourniret. The Virgin Hunters, also known as Monique Olivier and Michel Fourniret, were a pair of serial murderers. If you enjoy reading about serial killers, you might be familiar with these pair. Before he met Monique Olivier, Fourniret had quite the life. 4 children were born to him during his 2 marriages, but they were both annulled when Fourniret was imprisoned twice for sexual offenses against children. He tried to find a pen partner while serving his second sentence. Monique Olivier, a nurse, enters. She waited for Fourniret when he was released early from prison in 1986, for good behavior, no less, and they started dating. At that point, the murdering spree started. The now married pair had committed a number of felonies. Between 1987 and 2001, there were numerous killings, harassments, and even kidnappings. They especially sought out virgins, who Olivier confirmed had been untouchable prior to Fourniret's rape and execution. These crimes made headlines and instilled a great deal of dread in the populace as a result. However, they were eventually apprehended because their final intended victim managed to flee. They were detained in 2003, and their conviction came about in 2008. Both were given a life sentence without the possibility of release. How a child killer in Alabama transitioned from death row to a parole hearing. The deaths of 2 persons are the fault of Alvin and Judith Nealy. The pair had committed a total of 2 killings before being apprehended by the authorities. Alvin eloped with the teenage Judith, leaving his wife and 3 kids behind. They started with a series of armed robberies in the South, and it wasn't until later that anyone was actually killed. At age 16, Judith fell pregnant with twins, but the couple continued on. They were both imprisoned after a botched robbery attempt, and they reunited in 1982 after their release. Number 4. Judith and Alvin Nealy. How a child killer in Alabama transitioned from death row to a parole hearing. The deaths of two persons are the fault of Alvin and Judith Nealy. The pair had committed a total of 2 killings before being apprehended by the authorities. Alvin eloped with the teenage Judith, leaving his wife and 3 kids behind. They started with a series of armed robberies in the South, and it wasn't until later that anyone was actually killed. At age 16, Judith fell pregnant with twins, but the couple continued on. They were both imprisoned after a botched robbery attempt, and they reunited in 1982 after their release. A 13-year-old girl was their first victim. She was tortured, raped, and then killed in a hotel in Alabama. They carried out other crimes after hitting their initial target, with a couple becoming their next victims. This, however, was unsuccessful since one of their victims lived and implicated the two of them. Judith Nealy was the youngest woman to ever receive the death penalty in American history after being found guilty of their crimes and being condemned to death. Her punishment was later changed to life in prison, where she currently resides. Alvin received a life sentence and passed away in custody in 2005. Number 3. Otis Toole and Henry Lucas. The deadliest team in American history, Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. Serial killer documentary. Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas were 2 of history's most infamous serial killers. They alleged to have perpetrated hundreds of killings as well as other offenses including rape and arson collectively. That number may reach 600 if the authorities were to believe Lucas. Their history of physical and sexual abuse as children had a significant impact on their relationship. They discovered a kindred spirit in each other as a result of this experience, starting their criminal and personal partnership. However, before they met, both men had a history of murder. In 1960, Lucas killed his mother and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. After being freed from a second jail sentence in 1975, Toole was thought to have already killed 4 people when he met him at a Florida charity kitchen. They teamed up soon after, traveling across 26 states while killing people and raping women during the remainder of the 1970s. Their relationship, however, ran into trouble when Lucas developed feelings for Toole's teenage niece Becky Powell. With Toole abandoned, Lucas fled with the one female he ever loved. Becky's life would sadly end very soon. She passed away at the age of 15, and no less at the hands of Lucas. Soon after, Lucas was taken into custody in Texas. Later, in 1984, Toole would be detained for setting a man on fire while he was still alive. After being taken into custody, the 2 men started admitting to numerous murders. They both received death sentences for this string of atrocities, but later, for various reasons, these sentences were converted to life in prison. After serving less than 20 years, both Toole in 1996 and Lucas in 2001,